Welcome to our event this morning. The event is titled Improving Service Members' Transition from the Military, the Role of the Federal Government and Nonprofit Organizations, and How Current Efforts Could Be Strengthened. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Rajiv Ramchand, and I co-direct the Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute, along with my colleague, Carrie Farmer.
Great, thank you, Rajiv, and thank you everyone for being here. We're really excited to have all of you here to talk about this important topic of how we can collectively improve military to civilian transition. As Rajiv said, I'm co-director of the Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute. We wanted to make you aware, as you can tell by the cameras in the back, that today's event is being recorded, and it's being live streamed as well to a few people who were not able to join us in person today. So just wanted to let you all know that it's being recorded. Before we dig into the meat of today's presentation, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about the Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute. How are we switching slides? Is that going to work? Okay, great. So as many of you likely know, RAND has a long history of conducting research on many topics, but we've done a lot of work understanding service members, their experiences, veterans policy, and all of that work has come under an umbrella of the Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute, thanks to a generous gift from the Epstein Family Foundation. So that was in March of 2021. We received that gift and were able to stand up this institute, which has really enabled us to think holistically about veterans' well-being. As you all know, many aspects of a veteran's life is affected by the transition process, and we're really proud that we are conducting research across a large number of areas related to veterans' well-being, as you can see on this slide. While Rajiv and I both have backgrounds in health and healthcare, the Institute itself covers many topics. So we are really interested in education and employment, and then in topics like extremism and veteran families and reducing suicide. So our research really runs the gamut of issues affecting veterans policy. All right, turn it back over to Rajiv.
All right, so the best way to stay updated on all the work that we have coming out, for those of you who aren't on our newsletter already, is to sign up for our newsletter. You can do so at our website, which is veterans.rand.org. We want to also mention a few other things before we get into the meat of today's presentation that you'll find on our website. So we have a series called Veterans Issues in Focus. We have some of them up front. When we stepped up the Institute, we really learned that people wanted, oftentimes, in addition to the in-depth RAND research reports that we're all used to and that Jeff will be talking about today, shorter essays that provide overviews of key policy topics as well as policy recommendations associated with those, as well and gaps in the literature, so where we think research is needed. So we have a series of those essays. I think there's around 10 of them. We're growing that collection. Again, it's called Veterans Issues in Focus, and they're really brief, kind of a step away from what you might be used to as a RAND research product, but really an explainer of key policy topics. And these are some of the issues that we have, and some of them are out there on the table. So please take them and peruse them as you leave today. We also host every other week, or every other month, sorry, that would be a lot of organizing, but every other month we host a webinar series, and this is usually it coincides with the release of a RAND report on a key policy topic. We discuss the report really briefly for 10 minutes. We often have policymakers, representatives from the VA and nonprofit organizations who are there to discuss the issue. Our most recent one was in reference to a report that we released last week, actually, on the state of healthcare for LGBTQ veterans and how state-level policies may affect their well-being. Our next one is in July, and it will be focused on the psychedelic policy landscape and how that affects veterans. So as you know, many veterans organizations were at the grassroots of encouraging alternative treatments for PTSD, depression, suicide prevention, and many have looked at the promise that psychedelic therapy may hold. And so this study will really look at the legal landscape, because as the science is evolving, so too is policy, especially at the state and local level. And so we'll look at kind of the impact of those policies on veterans' access to these compounds and potentially alternative treatments. Today we're going to be talking about education and employment, but we also have other research, and here is a list of some of the things that we've had most recently come out. You can already see, some of the ones that I've already talked about, but again, we're focused on transition. We had a recent report on extremism that came out, and so we're really just eager to keep sharing the information with you. We have new research that will be coming out relatively soon on veteran families, and kind of looking at how veteran families, not military families, and there's some really kind of interesting highlights from that work. We have a great report that we're working with, sponsored by in partnership with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. So in September, we have an update of our caregiver report that will be coming out. So really just a lot of really interesting things on the horizon. But we're here today to talk about military to civilian transition services, and Carrie's going to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Rajiv. So let's get into today's presentation. Today, we released a report entitled Federal Programs to Assist Military to Civilian Employment Transitions. This report and today's event was sponsored by the Heinz Endowments. And so we're really grateful to the Heinz Endowments for funding this work, and really for supporting the research that we're doing and making it possible. The Heinz Endowments has a long history of supporting veterans employment, fund many organizations that are dedicated to improving employment. And so they asked us to understand the federal landscape of transition, and how those federal programs support veterans in the process of returning to civilian life and getting a job in the civilian sector. So we've included at your seats the executive summary of that report, along with a flyer that briefly describes the findings from this report, and lets you know about a companion report that we're working on that examines the nonprofit landscape and the role of nonprofit organizations in filling some of the gaps that federal programs don't cover. So that report will be coming out later this summer, so we'll be sure to let you know about it. We'll put in another quick plug for our newsletter, where you could definitely hear about that report and other reports at our website. So today, Jeff Wenger, my colleague, will walk us through the report that was released today. Following his presentation, we'll invite a panel to the stage to talk about employment transitions. And then after a break, another panel will discuss the role of education and education benefits. We're honored to have a true American patriot help us close out the event today, Chuck Hagel. As you may know, Secretary Hagel was instrumental in the passage of the post-9/11 GI Bill, and he has continued to remain dedicated to issues affecting veterans as they transition to civilian life, including recent chairmanship of the Veterans Justice Commission. But first, Jeff Wenger is a senior economist at RAND. He also directs the RAND Lowy Family Middle Class Pathways Center, which focuses on issues and opportunities to improve the well-being of the middle class. So turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate it. Today I'm going to talk to you about this presentation about this paper that we just recently completed, and I'm going to use my notes from this screen so I don't have to turn my head, and I'm going to ask Rajiv to kindly click through for me. It's a great pleasure to present this work to you today. As you all know, somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 service members transition every single year, depending on whether we're looking at the active component or reserve component or combined. And how smooth this transition goes can have significant impacts on both the transitioning service member and their family. So we want to take this issue very seriously and understand it completely. Our recent work, not just this paper, but a broader set of work, strives to understand how veterans are transitioning to civilian employment and what services are supporting this population. So there are three main components to this work that's funded by the Heinz Endowment. The first is a series of roundtable discussions with transitioning service members, trying to understand what's the nature of the problem, and it's titled, This is Solvable. The second, which is today's focus, is a paper that looks at all of the federal transition programs across the federal government. And the third paper, which is forthcoming, is going to look at the nonprofit landscape and how it's impacting the transition. The federal government spends about $13 billion a year on military to civilian employment transition programs. But there's relatively little known about them in terms of how effective they are and what outcomes and impacts they have for transitioning service members. There's just not a lot of independent research that focuses on examining these programs. So what did we do in this paper? We went out and surveyed the entire landscape of research, looked at all of the evidence that was out there. We then identified gaps in programs, analyzed the funding, and identified the opportunities that we think we could use to improve the transition programs. Now, GAO has done something very similar to this, and we thought that their definition of what a transition program was a good one. It was very broad. It focused on both education assistance, employment assistance, self-employment, and how you achieve a civilian employment. So rather than reinvent the whole wheel, we said, let's take a look at what GAO does and use that same definition, but we're gonna put a different lens on it. We're gonna examine this in a fundamentally different way to try and understand not just where our programs are affecting individuals, but where we're putting our resources. So our focus here is more on how we're spending the money and who we're spending money on. As I've said, there are about 45 of these programs. You can see in this slide behind me where they're located. 11 of them are in the Department of Defense. I won't read you the whole slide. Many of the programs are small, have very small budgets, have very small foci. They tend to say, okay, well, we're going to take a transitioning service member and give them opportunities to become a teacher or opportunities to become a nurse. Highly focused, highly specialized programs. Difficult to evaluate and difficult to understand what kinds of resources we're actually putting in place. So one of the main takeaways of this study that we did was to look at where we're spending our money in transition. And this slide here just provides a visual image of 95% of federal transition program dollars fund education programs. I was surprised by this. I mean, I guess I shouldn't have been when I think about the post 9/11 GI Bill and how expensive it is and how many people utilize that benefit, and also where the money goes to universities. But it struck me that, and let me just be very, very clear here, education benefits are extremely important. They're important for recruiting. They're important for an earned benefit for people who served in the military. They are extremely important, but not everyone uses them. In fact, fewer than half of service members actually use the post 9/11 GI Bill benefit. So as a consequence, we started thinking about where we're spending our money and how many people are not being recipients of benefits that they could use for transition. If in fact, only 50% of people are using the post 9/11 GI Bill, there are lots of people who need transition help, need a job, but aren't actually using post 9/11 GI Bill to help them facilitate and get that next job. So in the next slide, we just see what we call the Big Four, budgetary Big Four. These this is where we're spending our transition money. And again, not to be confused with the 95%, but 94% of the total amount of money we're spending are on these 4 programs. And you can see that the post 9/11 GI Bill is by far the largest expenditure. Veteran readiness and employment. Again, another education benefit, dependence educational assistance, and tuition assistance program is the third of the big 4. And as I said earlier, we're not spending resources to try and understand how effective these programs are. How much money we should be spending and how we're examining the outcomes is not being done systematically in this research. Not in this research, we're just pointing this out. There are some studies out there that have looked at the impact of, say, the post 9/11 GI Bill. The effects on earnings are somewhat limited, at least in this study. Some studies have even shown negative returns, i.e. you learn by the time you pay your tuition and your foregone earnings and you get your return on education, on net it's negative. Now, there are other studies out there that are doing better and showing different things. We're putting larger new data sets together, so we're beginning to crack this nut, but we're not quite there yet. Lastly, the TAP program. We've done a recent evaluation in this, not we, RAND, but the Juice Department of Labor has done a recent evaluation, or commissioned a recent evaluation of this. And while it shows that most transitioning service members are active in the labor market and experience low levels of unemployment, non-participation, some transitioning service members actually earned lower wages as a result of going through TAP. Now, I don't believe that it's causal. I think that there's probably an association there for people who elected not to go to TAP and selected out. But these are the kinds of evaluations that are needed but aren't being done. So I'm going to move on to the key findings in an effort to try and keep us on time, which was my key mandate here. Many of these occupational programs that I talked about earlier serve relatively few veterans. And I think there's a lot of redundancy in the system. Programs provide referrals for education. There's 22 separate programs that provide referrals for education, 23 for employment, 17 for self-employment. So there's a lot of redundancy in the system, and there are also gaps in the systems. There are very few opportunities for job-specific skill development, right? And there's very little individualized employment assistance. There's a new program, the ENPP, the Employment Navigator Pilot Program, that's trying to provide some of this individualized employment assistance, but it is just a pilot, and it's going to rely on the private sector to help make that connection for veterans. So what can federal agencies do? The first thing we think they can do is, at a minimum, mandate consistent and routine budget reporting for all programs that support military to civilian transitions. One of the things that we had a really difficult time doing in this research was actually finding consistent budget reporting for all the programs. How much does each of these programs cost, and how many people does it serve? That was much harder than we anticipated. Second, we should identify opportunities to streamline the employment transition landscape and improve its oversight. So I personally think that the transition landscape is a very confusing one. There's lots of programs. I don't know where to go. I've been told lots of different locations. I can get the same service from lots of different people. More of a one-stop type of program where I could get lots of services in one location from a variety, from one person, and not have this confusing federal landscape of 45 different programs. I think this might help significantly. I think this recommendation is probably one of the most important. How are we going to improve the transition programs if we don't know what they're doing and what they're not doing? In order to understand what they're doing and what they're not doing, you actually need to evaluate them. We should provide multiple evaluations of the largest programs all the time. These programs are evolving and changing, and we want to know how they're going to change and how effective they're going to be. And right now, I don't believe we know. Two more recommendations. We need to dedicate more funding to programs that help transitioning service members and their families as soon as they enter the civilian labor market. We need to be thinking about how to re-emphasize employment. We've got so much money dedicated to education. How do we re-emphasize employment? Even people who are going to use the post 9/11 GI Bill, many of them are going to go back and work simultaneously. So of that of those, 50% are actually going to use the GI Bill. Many of them are going to actually need a job too. So I want to refocus and put employment at the center of our transitioning program and re-emphasize that and dedicate more funding to that. How do we make a better transition? What should we be transitioning to? What should individuals who are in specific occupations transition to? How do we improve that process? Our recommendation for the universities is that schools should provide veteran counseling services as a condition of receiving post 9/11 GI Bill funding. They should help veterans select courses of study that are appropriate for them. They should link veterans with employers. They should provide support for navigating these federal benefits and provide mental health and counseling services. And they should be veteran-specific, veteran-focused. And lastly, we want to explore opportunities to outsource career counseling or provide transitioning service members and veterans with vouchers. One of the things that we hear from veterans is that when they transition from DoD into the civilian sector, that transition is abrupt. You move from DoD and you become a civilian, and there's no easy transition into the civilian sector. So one of the ideas that we had was to potentially provide them with a voucher for some career counseling services so that when they moved into the civilian sector, they had an opportunity to link up with someone directly who could provide them some advice and some guidance and some counseling. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jeff, for setting the stage. Appreciate it and the work that you've done. I'd like to introduce the employment panel to the stage, so please come on up. We have joining us today Honorable James Rodriguez, who's the Assistant Secretary for Veterans Employment and Training Services at the Department of Labor, John Bursler, who's the Chief Veterans Experience Officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Agnes Schaefer, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, and Ross Dickman, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Hire Heroes USA. And the panel is going to be moderated by our colleague and one of the authors of the report that Jeff just introduced, Meredith Claycamp. Meredith is a senior sociologist at RAND, but also a professor at the University of Maryland. So thanks so much. Take it away.
Excuse me. Thanks, Rajiv. Thank you all for agreeing to come up here and talk about sort of your segment in the federal sector or not in the federal sector, adjacent to it, and how your organization fits into this ecosystem and this landscape. I thought we'd jump right into it because I can imagine that there are lots of questions that people might have, and you all might have lots of feedback. I wonder, though, if we could take just a second and maybe introduce yourself to the audience and tell them why you're here and who you're representing. So Agnes, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Agnes Schaefer. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with friends and old colleagues. Prior to taking this job, I was at RAND for 17 years. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I've done quite a bit of work on this, and now that I'm in this job, I'm looking at it from a different perspective, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great.
And howdy, I'm John Bursler. I'm with the Veterans Experience Office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I get all my health care at VA, and I got I went to my physical therapist yesterday, so if you see me grabbing my leg, that's because she beat me up pretty good, but at the DC VA. I've been through the many benefits journeys, including the education benefits journey that we'll talk about a little bit today, and just excited to share what we're doing to improve that sometimes difficult transition from military to civilian life experience.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Ross Dickman, CEO at Hire Heroes USA. We're an employment services nonprofit that serves veterans, military members, and military spouses. And I'm an Army veteran, so we'll try not to get in too many arguments with John about it.
Yeah, over there too.
I'm stuck in between the Marines.
Good morning, everyone. James Rodriguez, Assistant Secretary, Department of Labor, Veteran Employment Training Service. I'm a retired Marine, and I've been doing the veteran employment space work for about 15 years now, since my retirement. Corporate side, government side. I know many of you all know my time as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Office of Warrior Care Policy when it used to exist, working on wounded, ill, and injured programs and their transition journey as well, which is in itself a unique challenge. But I'm glad to be here. This is always important conversation, so thanks for inviting labor.
Absolutely. How could we not? For the employment panel in particular. So I thought what we could do is I'll start with kind of a broad, open-ended question and go down the line, and then, I tend to think these are much more interesting when you all have conversations amongst yourselves as well as we do this, so don't feel like you have to, it's not a research interview. Feel free to, engage in collaborative conversation as well. So, one of the things you heard my colleague Jeff talk about was the Transition Assistance Program, and we know that that's a sort of cross-government program with many offices involved. So I wonder if, for our panelists, you could talk about how you and your office work together to implement TAP, at least from your perspective. And Ross, I wonder if maybe you could sort of take that angle from the perspective of nonprofits and how, or non-governmental organizations, and how you feel like your organizations fit into the TAP experience, if at all. So I'll start, Agnes, and you can lead the way.
So I will say that our big push is with nonprofits and companies. Mm-hmm. So we're sort of taking a multi-pronged approach, educating our service members as well as educating the labor market about the kinds of skills that our service members have. And so we are reaching out to nonprofits to help support our service members. But we've had meetings with CEOs. We had one recently, and it was a wide range of CEOs. And one of them came up to me afterwards, and they were from a tree cutting company. And they were absolutely ecstatic because they didn't realize that, we put as many people as we do, 100,000 out into the market annually. And they were like, this is the perfect pool for us. They are dedicated, reliable, physically fit, and, they take safety very, very seriously. So it's those kinds of outreach things that we're doing to kind of educate the labor market about the talent that we have.
Great. John?
Yeah, I'm not going to only speak for the Veterans Experience Office, but my colleague Melissa Cohen is here from VA's Outreach, Transition, and Economic Development Office, which really manages the day-to-day VA one-day TAP course, and she is also the co-chair with James, and with Margarita, which is on James's team, and our counterparts at DoD, and what we call the Joint Executive Committee, or JEC for short, and we have a Transition Executive Committee where a lot of the joint work between the three agencies gets done, and that includes the service branches, of course, too. So we have all of our individual TAP managers represented from the different service branches. So that work has been going on for many years, of course, and we have our next meeting at VA just down the street on Thursday, and where we're going to talk a lot about some of the objectives and milestones that we've been driving on The other piece that we've been involved in, and I guess why I might be invited here today from the Veterans Experience Office perspective, is kind of taking a more holistic look at the transition experience from this perspective of not just the agencies that serve the transitioning service members and their family members, but making sure that we're getting that voice of the customer and actually redesigning some of the pieces of that journey from the individual's perspective. So we created a new journey map, which I think points to a lot of the recommendations that Jeff mentioned, especially the second one. It's so confusing. There's so many different resources, and you really see that in some of the personas reflected in the human-centered design insights that we gleaned from this 3-year-long sprint. And then we're also looking at a way to kind of encapsulate a lot of those resources and then personalize some of the programs that we saw, the volume of programs that are provided just by federal agencies alone, not counting our nonprofit partners. How do we kind of cut down the noise a little bit and make sure it resonates with each individual service member and spouses as a persona in that endeavor too? So we're actually testing that this summer. So we'd invite y'all to, as subject matter experts in the field, to participate in that. We'll also be testing it with end users, transitioning service members at 10 different installations that DoD has already provided us access to. And then we'll hopefully be launching it in the fourth quarter of this year. So very, very soon, and very excited to do that as a digital experience, personalized checklist, so to speak. We've also worked with the Army to prototype a commander's dashboard, which really helps. If you remember the GAO report that came out last fall, of which several of us participated in a Senate Veterans Affairs Committee hearing on the topic of participation alone in the transition experience from that 12 months prior to separation, we learned that around 70% weren't starting the process on time. So we're now prototyping a dashboard that'll enable commanders to view their subordinate units in almost like a red light, yellow light, green light scenario on which units are compliant with that requirement to start the transition at 12 months so that they can help them meet those objectives. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening, and we can talk a little bit more about improvements to the curriculum, but it's just been fun to literally dig in with not only the agencies and Enterprise DoD at DOL and others, but at the individual service branches. And Ivan can attest, we've had some very healthy conflict conversations among the group, but it's been, I think, all led to the right direction on behalf of the individual service member and their family.
Great, thank you. Ross, what's your take on how the nonprofits work together with the TAP experience?
Well, I think nonprofits fill an important role, an essential role in navigating transition assistance programs. They not only fill gaps, but they bring the highest degree of personalization capable because we're front and center at the user's needs. John spoke to some of those aspects of personalization and areas where someone might be caught or not caught in the systems that exist and the policies and time barriers that exist around them. One of the areas where a nonprofit can fit is, there's policies around when transition assistance programming has to be executed, but most service members start thinking about when are they going to leave the military when they have their first bad boss in the military. And they go, I don't know if I can do this any longer. Well, that could be 5 years before they actually get out. It could be 20 years before they get out. Day one. What type of, it could be day one, as John says. Drill instructor. So what kind of support do they need then to be the best effective soldier, the best effective member of that unit, and to be thinking about that long tail of their career journey and their skills building? That's where nonprofits can fill that. They also, because they're kind of integrated systems, have data interoperability within their own ecosystem. So if a nonprofit's serving that person who has 5 years till they get out, that case management system isn't moving around between a bunch of different federal or state agencies, and stuff's not getting lost in the shuffle. It's one integrated case management approach which allows for multiplying effect. And so we try to partner really well with all these agencies as well as state-level agencies to make sure that we are bringing that nuance that we get from that customer and user-focused experience.
Great.
Yeah, so John took all of the things I was going to say. But truthfully, the Joint Executive Committee is a key committee between DoD, VA. Department of Labor, for the first time this year, is now a permanent member of the Joint Executive Committee. We've always been an invited member. And the reason that's important is because now we have the ability to bring things up to the committee that we feel are important to take on, right, with regards to discussions that involve all three of the agencies. And that is inherently important. So that's a big win for the administration this year. And as John mentioned, the TAP Executive Committee, where our team, Margarita Devon, our career dash, she works very closely with Melissa and her team, and Melissa and I have got to even testify together at the House to talk about our collaboration. But I think one of the areas that's often overlooked is what happens at the lower levels outside of Washington, D.C. What's happening at our American Job Centers, what's happening at our workforce, 54 state workforce agencies, where we collaborate very closely with the Department of Veterans Affairs and other federal agencies, where a veteran who is in the community, like we're talking about, they've been out of the military, or in some cases, they're using the American Job Centers when they're active duty and they're looking for advice on how to navigate the community where they're going to. But that's where a lot of the work gets done. We have done training with our teams at the American Job Centers for the PACT Act, for example. When someone is coming in and they're using employment resources, we ensure that they are aware of their ability to apply for PACT Act if they actually qualify for that. And even if they don't qualify, we ask them to make sure that they take a look at it. So the community level, which is outside of Washington, D.C., right, across the entire country, we have resources that collaborate on a daily basis with our VA partners, but of course our other federal agency partners, Small Business Administration, where we do a lot of great work there. And I think there's other key components of the federal government that are part of this entire TAP process that oftentimes we forget about because we think about the big ones who really have such an impact. But the SBA is so important. The Department of Education is so important, right? All of those areas where we have a touch point to support that transitioning service member, military spouse, and the veterans after separation from military service is inherently important. One of the things that I would talk about briefly is that the programs that are also key when someone makes that first year decision, or that transition, I should say, after that first year is so inherently important when we're making sure that they're connected to the right resources. And we have that tail of support, right? Where they have the ability to stay connected to some federal agencies, but also get connected with our partners who are veteran support organizations, military support organizations, because that's where the community is at. And that's what the veterans are looking for when they get out and they go and work in specific communities, or they're looking for specific industries. And so it's inherently important for us to pool all of those resources. One of the last things I'll say about this is that Department of Labor, we are the workforce experts. I've got folks on my team who've been in my agency for 30 plus years, 20 plus years. And they came from state workforce agencies, and now they're working for the federal government. So they're bringing that expertise, or in many cases, they work for us and then go right over to the VA. So they continue that service. So the collaboration is enduring, and that's where we work the best when it comes to supporting our service members who've transitioned out. There's a lot of work we still got to do. And in that vein, we've looked internally. One of the things that was mentioned on the slides is how do we do an internal review? When I came to the office 3.5 years ago, I looked at exactly that. How do we do a customer experience review of what our programs are providing and are not providing? And we work very closely with John and his team at the VA to do the exact same thing. How are we interconnected? How are those touch points in that transition process, in that journey, how are they connected? So we didn't just look internally at DOL, we looked at where our partners are connecting with the folks we're touching as well. So we've learned a lot from that. We've published the first findings from the customer experience review where we did a human-centered design approach. Those are John's words. And so we've done that very well, and we're in our next phase of that. So we're consistently learning to improve our execution of programs at the Department of Labor.
Great. I want to ask, because you brought up John and the VA's ongoing work thinking about the customer experience, John, I wonder if you could piggyback a little bit on that and tell us sort of what are the things that you're learning from the customer's experience that relate to sort of the employment transition challenge, and what is VA doing either themselves or in partnership with others to kind of fill the need, meet the needs that you're discovering through this customer experience endeavor?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. I think 3 important insights that we gleaned from a lot of this design research, and then we also looked at a lot of desk research like the RAND team did. We also did a lot of surveying of that same population One is that they want this information further upstream in their journey, well before they transit, well before the 12-month window that they're required by the Vow to Hire Heroes legislation in 2011, or the 24 months if you're retiring. And so how might we kind of think about better ways to push this information digitally in a mobile experience, because most of our service members are now millennials and Gen Z, right? So we have to think about designing for those personas and getting that information to them so it's like just in time and it's actionable. Another important insight that Melissa and I have particularly honed in on is that they really want more one-on-one time with folks that can understand the benefits journey, so applying for disability compensation or education benefits in particular, which I know we'll talk about in the next panel, but also job counseling and how might we bring other resources outside of the federal government to bear. So now we have 45 minutes, and this is to Melissa and her incredible team for driving these insights really into action. We've now built in the last 45 minutes of that VA one-day TAP, which, by the way, is the highest attendance of all 5 days of the mandatory TAP program. Everybody wants to know about their VA benefit. We've now dedicated the last 45 minutes of that day to veteran service organizations and NGOs that we've partnered with, and they can apply essentially for certain time slots to present on their information. So that's another way that we can make it more actionable and develop kind of like that one-on-one relationship to not only file a claim, but help get a job. And I think, and finally, I think a bigger insight was, how can we involve the family member in this journey too? Because in many cases, spouses or caregivers or other family members that are in many cases more invested in that transition from military to civilian life need to have a seat at the table or a seat in the classroom. And so we're trying to find more, not only physical space, but virtual space to ensure that those individuals are a part of that learning experience and making it more immersive instead of like the death by PowerPoint that we've been doing so long, thinking about micro-learning and bringing in, so we were just talking about this yesterday about, especially for Gen Z and millennial personas, like thinking about how the TikTok tap almost, like for each individual module of kind of a quick bluff of what it includes. So it's really interesting to think about what TAP could look like, and not just a 5-day mandatory course, but an entire career, whether that's 4 years or 20 years plus, where you're actually thinking about when you take off that uniform.
Yeah. You have two forks, and I want to go both to Ross and to Agnes. So I'll start with Agnes, and then I'm going to come back, Ross, to you. Thinking about, excuse me, what you said earlier about how people transition, how people think about how early in their process, how early in their military experience they are or are not thinking about that transition. Made me think about kind of the Army Soldier for Life program and sort of a lot of the innovations that have taken place. Well, I don't know how innovative, it's like 5 years, 10 years at this point, but I'm wondering if Agnes, if you could tell me a bit about how those efforts to get service members to sort of move their thinking about their entire career life cycle and where their military experience fits into that. We've been trying to push that earlier in their career. I'm a sociologist, and one of the things the military is really good at is kind of convincing you that you need to be exclusively thinking about being a member of this institution. And I always wondered about the programs that were trying to get people to think earlier in their military career about what they were going to do afterwards. And the concern being that maybe you become less interested in the military experience and you start thinking a little too much about your post-military experience. So all of that's context for a simple question, which is, how are those efforts going? What have you seen in terms of any evolution? Positive, negative, jury's still out in terms of getting service members to think about their transition earlier.
So I just want to foot stomp what you're hearing, that they want it earlier. I also want it earlier for them. Because I worry that it's sort of an afterthought if we bolt it on to the end. So what we are trying to do is infuse the skills that they need early on, all the way in order to be successful both in the Army and then outside the Army. So what we're doing is we are infusing what we're calling foundational skills, communication skills, financial literacy kind of skills. How do you communicate in a workforce? What's appropriate in a professional environment? What's not? Kind of looking at those things all the way from basic training, the academy, ROTC, and then at echelon through their career, so that they're not sort of, unprepared when they enter the civilian workforce. So in addition to that, we have started the Soldier for Life program, which has just had sort of an amazing culture change. And I think that folks don't feel like they're falling off a cliff. They are still part of the team as they transition. And we will be there as a support network. If you go to our Soldier for Life website, it's one of the most cleanest, most organized websites. Like we've been talking about, they are overwhelmed with information. And I commend the RAND team for looking at gaps, overlaps. We need to do that for multiple reasons, partially because, we collectively have a flat budget right now. And so we need to find efficiencies where we can. And we need to do right by our service members by finding these efficiencies, filling those gaps, most importantly. It doesn't help if they're doing a bunch of programs that are the same thing, right? And so we really need to find those efficiencies. But the Soldier for Life website really lays out cleanly kind of the support network that is there for them. And it really has had this sort of teamwork spirit to it. There's Soldier for Life swag, that people are walking around in. And again, it just really emphasizes the fact that you are not going to fall into a black hole when you transition. We will still, have support for you. So,
great, thanks. So we've heard a lot. This is a report and this is a panel and an event about federal programs, but we've heard a lot about this kind of key role that's played by non-governmental programs. Ross, I wonder from your vantage point, I know it's maybe unfair, everyone here is representing their organization. You're kind of representing an entire, field. So I know that that's not fair. So you can speak for your organization.
Fair enough.
But from your vantage point, what are some of the challenges to being such an important and relevant partner to the government in doing the work to assist folks with their transition? And I guess I'll just lay out the elephant in the room question that's embedded in that, and that is the reliance, is this partnership going to become a reliance, and if so, will that be sustainable into the future from your side of the
Sure.
gap?
So easy question, right?
Yeah, exactly. No pressure.
Challenges, we saw a big explosion of veteran supporting organizations over the last 25 years. How much of that is duplication of effort? How much of that serves a unique or essential need? That's to be determined. The market has gone through an explosion. It might need to go through a compression or consolidation in some areas, not to red ocean everything, but that means resource constraint in terms of how does this gap-filling effort that VSOs serve, how do they generate the resources? Because federal budgets are flat, interest rates are high, the wars have ended, so philanthropy efforts are shifting from more efforts on welcoming and caring for returning warriors into what does that mean for maybe memorialization or integration into community. For a long time, transition support was sort of nested as well with returning warrior care support. So someone returning from a deployment in their transition to civilian society were sort of merged under one umbrella of how someone might view caring for veterans. Now there's a big part of that, and the sort of national call to action is gone. Well, the transition from the military didn't change any. It's still a major cultural and identity shift. There's still skills gap, challenges that have to be done. You serve a, if you're a Marine infantryman, like I'm surrounded by right now for some reason, they serve a very unique skill set in the Marines. That takes work to disaggregate and validate and connect those skills to what employers hire based off of. That challenge isn't going away. It's going to get harder and harder as we shift into this post-war period. So that's some of the challenge that we're seeing, I think, is the market dynamics are changing. I think it's hard to say sustainability-wise because you never know what might happen. Philanthropy plays a major role in supporting this gap-filling effort, which is coming from a place of a different kind of call to service. But that can't be the only mechanism of that. And historically in the United States, the collaboration and interaction of nonprofits and philanthropy of kind of solving problems at the user level, and the federal government of scaling those to serve them across state, local, national resourcing, that's worked. That's helped move our economy and our country forward. So I think it's encouraging that we're having these conversations around what does that collaboration need to look like in the next phase, but it does have to incorporate some kind of aspect of who owns what where and how is it delivered. As long as we keep a primary focus on the highest quality intervention of evidence-proven, evidence-backed initiatives with a focus on measurement of outcome versus output, then I think that will lead us to a path of sustainability, but it's like they're hard conversations. There's no one right answer.
Thank you for echoing the importance of program evaluation, something that was a key finding in the report. I want to ask potentially an uncomfortable question for everyone. And I think we're all here because we believe in the compelling case that everyone transitioning out of the military, right, deserves support, and we want those to be a positive experience. But potentially from the outside, when sometimes colleagues who don't have expertise in this area, when I say, I work around policy around veterans employment, and they say, oh, is that a problem, right? Isn't the unemployment rate for veterans quite low, right? Aren't there plenty of job opportunities? Aren't veterans doing better than civilians in terms of their unemployment rate? So an open question for the panel, and maybe Mr. Rodriguez, you might want to start it off. Because the unemployment rate isn't sky high anymore, what is the problem that we need policy to solve right now in this area? What do we need federal policy and programs to be doing for veterans? And two things that I'll throw out on the table that I hear quite a bit. One is retention. It's not just getting the first job, it's getting the right job. Mm-hmm. And the other issue that I hear quite a bit about is not that it's an unemployment issue, it's a challenge of underemployment. Yeah. So I sort of open that to the panel, but we'll start with you.
Well, that's a great question, and I mean, we get this one often. One of the biggest challenges that you all actually identified in your report, we spend billions of dollars on education, but a fraction of that on employment. And I think that's the inherent piece of that. So when we look at how do we navigate the employment resources from a federal standpoint, investing in those employment resources to help with those employment outcomes is inherently important. And so we're continuously working with Congress to educate them on how our programs are inherently effective when they're utilized appropriately, and at the timely piece of that, right? So last year alone, 242,000 veterans were served, well, let me rephrase that, 242,000 transitioning service members were served by our programs at Department of Labor. 11,000 plus courses were administered last year, virtual and in person. And so taking that, getting that education and training has to transition into something meaningful employment careers. So what happens is when you look at the landscape of veterans when they transition out their first year, oftentimes they're going to the first job that they obtain. And so we know that's a good thing. However, when they use additional resources like our Employment Navigator Partnership Program, when they use that, we're seeing they're getting employed 2 to 3 months before someone who did not use the Employment Navigator, which is a program that started in April of 2021 officially. we're seeing great data there that shows that they're actually getting higher income as well when they make that transition because of our 60-plus partners who are significant when it comes to navigating the space, as Ross mentioned, at the local levels, but also across the entire country where there are work opportunities. But the biggest challenge is getting them into careers versus just a job. The other piece of that, which is often left out of conversation, is employers. Employers understanding the value that veterans bring into the workplace and ensuring that they are entering the workplace at the right appropriate levels, officer and enlisted alike, ensuring that they are not only coming into the work as a junior manager if they've been a staff non-commissioned officer or mid-level career officer, right? Ensuring that they have the leadership qualities that they've developed over the military time frame and put those into the corporate place, right? So I speak to CEOs often, and one of the biggest things that they're looking for is someone who can manage risk, who has the ability to manage challenges, and to be adaptable and learn. All those things are significant to your military experience. And when we look at that, we still have a disconnect, though, often when we're talking about entering into the right workforce or at the right levels of the workforce. So we talk about that specifically and consistently. This goes back through the training program of that one-on-one counseling that happens with our Employment Navigator program, which is different than just going through a TAP class. Now they're doing one-on-one counseling, and they get to navigate the process of identifying what careers you want to go, what type of education you need, what license, what certifications that you also need. One of the biggest challenges we've also seen is that the approval of those licenses and certifications from our military service that are recognized in the employment space, and ensuring that those are transferred as well. So if you develop all these skill sets, you have license certifications, regardless of what your MOS is, and you can take those and they're transferable into the employment space, will also help you get into a career at a different level. We work very closely with unions, and so a lot of work is being made with regards to accepting those license certifications. If they're going through apprenticeship programs, and they can now enter certain apprenticeship programs at a more robust level than someone that has to go through the entire early part of the journeyman process, they're accepting those license certifications. But we don't have every industry doing that. And though there's a lot of work that's been done, there's still a lot that has to be done. And again, this takes a lot of us as a federal organization, but it takes a lot of our partnerships with the VSOs and MSOs, as I've always mentioned. You have to have a strong public-private partnership. Yeah. I mean, that goes without saying. And that's something we've consistently tried to develop, especially since I've been in this role, is looking at how do we strengthen those relationships from a corporate standpoint, how do we strengthen the relationships from a VSO, MSO standpoint, but also how do we consistently inform Congress. One of the things we do consistently is provide a 4 quarters meeting where we have the House and the Senate side, Republicans, Democrats, to really learn about our programs so they get to see where that investment is actually occurring and how we can expand on those investments. One of the challenges that was mentioned is, right, we do have a flat budget. We know that. So how do we streamline processes and programs to still meet the demands of what is being asked of us by our transition service members and our veterans?
Mm-hmm. And I think Carrie and I were discussing this yesterday, like the inclusion of education assistance in the GAO report and this report as well, being 95% of the total expenditure. I think we should challenge whether or not education assistance should be a part of the discussion for transition programs, quote unquote, because many of us use our access to our post 9/11 GI Bill benefits years after we leave the military, after our first or second job, talking about retention, Meredith. We can talk about that in a second. And for example, I didn't use my post 9/11 GI Bill until 4 years after I separated from the Marine Corps. So so we should maybe think about that and then focus maybe on the other 5% of those transition programs that are actually directly focused on transition from military to civilian life, and then continue to audit and evaluate. And I know that was one of the recommendations. We do the PSTAP every year, and then every couple of years we do a longitudinal study of the outcomes and the outputs from VA TAP, which is just, like I said, 1 out of 5 days in the course, but part of the whole journey. Melissa's team is also doing some great work for the economic development initiatives, which are really putting these big job fairs on in conjunction with our claims and enrollment, like healthcare enrollment fairs. So we've got 126 events through the end of this quarter, through the end of July 31st, that we are tracking and supporting through headquarters, but they're in the field, in communities. And this is not only an opportunity for vets to file a claim or enroll in healthcare or do their pre-need application for memorial affairs, but also to connect with local employers that are hiring in that community, private sector, public sector. So there's a lot of opportunities to continue to get the word out and then work across the agency to ensure our federal and nonprofit partners are a part of that. And then one other thing I'll mention, and just a plug for SkillsBridge, is we haven't really talked about that as an important employment program, is WARTAC, which is VA's kind of flagship SkillsBridge program, really takes individuals who are interested in serving, continuing their service out of uniform in the Department of Veterans Affairs as our veteran service representatives and our RVSRs too. So these are the individuals that are rating claims, essentially, and they've done more claims, they've delivered more benefits to more veterans than ever before in the last few years since the signing of the PACT Act, and that was due to a lot of the advocacy in this room that we're sitting in. So that's one great example of thousands of service members and spouses immediately transitioning into our workforce. And now we have the 4+1 commitment for military spouses, which is incredibly important as well, trying to make sure that we're creating and adjusting many of our career positions so that they are remote, so that military spouses can continue their career with the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I know that there are other phenomenal examples across the board.
I was just thinking about SkillsBridge. One of the challenges, is I have a couple of hats. This event as also an author on the report, is sort of how to account for the cost of the SkillsBridge program, right? Because, expenditures to the office versus what's effectively happening is, paying someone's DoD salary while they're in service to work at the VA or Microsoft or wherever. So, part of the report's recommendation to think about sort of transparent budget and financial information about our transition program is really important. We kind of couldn't account for the implicit cost of having however many people be paid by DoD to work someplace else, right, as an intern. But I appreciate you bringing up SkillsBridge. Agnes, I wonder, from the Army perspective, what are you seeing kind of on the ground right now? Does it still feel like getting the first job feels like people's most compelling problem, or is it more existential, right? How people are thinking about their transition experience into the workforce?
Well, let me take a step back,
Yeah.
because something we haven't talked about that I think is a really important aspect here is the civ-mil divide. And so we see challenges with that on both the recruiting side as well as the transition side. And it perplexes me that after 20 years of war, we have a country right now that doesn't understand its military. And I think there's several causes for that, partly because we have less than 1% serving. So it's very easy to say, oh, they went away, they did a job. But everybody, the country kind of is divorced from that experience. We have become over-concentrated in generational service, as well as, in our case, the Army is very concentrated in the South, the Southern Smile. So we have large swaths of the country that just don't see folks walking around in uniform. And so we are trying to do what we can to bridge that gap. And part of it is, on our end, letting the public know what the kaleidoscope of opportunities there are in the military, and the Army in particular. But then also, on the flip side, trying to expose our service members along the way to kind of the civilian workforce and what opportunities are there. And so I think we really need to, we've been trying to put more energy towards that. And I mentioned that in my first vignette, right? We're talking to CEOs, trying to explain to them and doing this translation of what skill sets our folks have and what kind of talent we can provide. So, but back to your original question, I think it's a mixed bag in terms of what folks are most worried about, and I think part of it is how well they're prepared. And so, again, that's why we're trying to infuse these skill sets along the way rather than having it as this last-minute thought.
Right.
And we really are kind of trying to pivot. If you look at the difference between general officer transitions, they start much earlier, and it is sort of much more immersive. And the other thing that I would emphasize is that we really move from a one-size-fits-all model to one that is more customized. Before I left RAND, one of the projects I worked on was looking at the reserve component experience with transitions. And basically what we did was we lifted and shifted the active component model onto the reserve component model. And there were all kinds of frictions because reserve component members transition all the time. This is part of their experience, the 180-day active component requirement. Folks were doing TAP 7, 8 times because they were on active orders for 6 months all the time. So again, and that caused burnout. People just had viscerally bad reactions, like I have to do it again. And in many cases, they were going back to a job, so they didn't need resume, services and things like that. So I think we just need to be careful about how we can customize it and get that counseling that we talked about, that one-on-one, warm handoff kind of experiences. The department and RAND kept me very gainfully employed when I was at RAND doing program evaluation. And this is just like so many other programs, right? We have this sort of coral reef of requirements, one on the other, it's always additive. And so we need to figure out ways to streamline that and get the help that people need most efficiently.
So I want to ask one final question kind of to the group. And we've heard a lot about either partnerships between agencies or, offices in the government or partnerships with outside entities. How do we know who a good partner is in this space? I mean, and embedded in that question are sort of two things. What are the outcomes we really want to see measured, right, as we think about evaluation? What are the important outcomes, not just outputs, that matter? And how do we know it when we see it, right? How can we know who might be effective at providing those kinds of outputs? And how can we enhance partnerships by making sure we know who are the ones to invest in and who are the ones to avoid, for lack of a better term? Ross, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. From an employment-focused lens specifically, looking at the program components and sequence of delivery that they use, the Veteran Metrics Initiative from Penn State's Clearinghouse was probably the most comprehensive analysis of program components and delivery approach with proven impact on employment outcomes. So that's a great model to start with in terms of what problem are they trying to solve, what mechanism of a delivery are they approaching it with, and do those align with the theory of change that the organization is aimed at. From there, discipline, and I think in focus in terms of articulating what they do, staying true to that. One of the pain points I think that we've seen in employment is trying to be all things to all people. It gets really hard to do tailored, focused, good at what you do approaches if you're all things under one umbrella. So can you be disciplined? Can you partner in those areas where people are more disciplined and better service providers than you are? I think those are hallmarks of who does a great job. Measuring successful outcomes in employment is really challenging, to be quite honest, because salary matters. But in terms of wage equity, veterans, military spouses, and women veterans are lagging when you look at it by the cost of living in areas that they live, when you think about the number of working members of the household, and when you think about the other costs that they're absorbing when they leave service. You could see a veteran get $100,000 and still be barely at the poverty line based on where they're living or other issues that they're worrying about. So it's not just salary, end state, bulleted, done. It's salary looked at in terms of the cost of where they're living and the other items that they've got on the docket. Retention matters, but there's a lot of numbers flown around over the last 20 years around veterans changing jobs, X% in their first year. But so much of that was good mobility. They got a promotion. What? Yes, great. Why penalize a great service provider that helped someone not only get that first job, but also leverage those skills to a promotion. People get hired on technical skills, and they get promoted on people skills and their ability to manage conflict and apply those technical skills and competencies at that next level. So how do we measure that? Good mobility versus bad mobility, upward mobility versus career stagnation. Getting a bit more nuanced in the measurement of that makes a big difference in terms of quality outcomes. I think another area that we hear a lot around that is it needs to be a partnership with the corporate partners and the hiring entities and the employers that make this possible is work satisfaction, role satisfaction. That matters. And it's really, really hard to figure out preceding someone being in the role. That's hard for the company to figure out, are they a good fit as well preceding the role? You can do all the assessments you want. I had a boss in the Army that said, someone's going to fake the funk as long as they need to. I don't know exactly what that meant, but I thought it meant that they're going to try to put on airs to fit in where they think they need to fit in. And you get a real sense of who someone is in their job after about 6 months. And the company gets that sense, the employee gets that sense of do they operate well with their peers. Employers shouldn't be penalized because they made a choice based off of putting someone in a role from all the interviewing and work that they did, and they just weren't a good fit. And that employee shouldn't be penalized. How do we help navigate that next movement is an important part of the system that I think right now we've got really blunt measurement approaches that miss a lot of that rich information and data that helps us do a better job over and over again.
Great. I want to be cognizant that we've got time to take a couple of questions. We've been having a conversation up here. I think there's 2 microphones in the back. If there are a couple of questions that folks might have, we would happily entertain it if you raise your hand. And tight quarters to get the microphone from the back to the front of the room.
Hi, I have a measurement question for the group, because I think this is a challenge. I've worked in the nonprofit space as an employer, now I work for a recruiting firm, and I think one of the problems of measuring, ultimately, outcomes, which is obviously a job, hopefully a good job that someone stays at, is that any given veteran does not have a linear path to that job. That veteran may hear a great Hire Heroes USA presentation at their TAP class, and then they may see a flyer for a Hiring Our Heroes or a Recruit Military hiring fair and go to that too. And at that hiring fair, they might meet an Orion talent recruiter who gives them great information about a job. They get a job. Every single one of those entities is going to claim that veteran and claim success for that job, and who knows which one of them actually helped or the whole thing helped. So how do we measure outcomes when there's such a big, I think, it's a good thing, a big, rich environment for veterans to use and utilize, and ultimately will get a job when all of those organizations are incentivized to take credit for that job once the veteran gets the job?
I'll start to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with all 3 of them saying that we played a part in this. They all did play a part. Can you get to the dynamic of the person's psyche of how much of each % of those, and then are we allocating percentages of success rate? That seems like a little bit too much. But figuring out where those interoperable aspects, creating that multiplying effect and reinforcing that would be the direction I'd want to take that. We have a great working relationship with Hiring Our Heroes and Eric and team, and have seen that service members and military spouses benefit, and hiring companies benefit, if they work with both of us. If they get one-on-one career coaching with us, a dedicated transition specialist who's their partner in their corner, and that informs the way they go about approaching the skill bridge connections that Hiring Our Heroes does. So they're getting better matches from that. They're performing better in their role, leads to a better outcome. Absolutely, both organizations should say, yes, we played a part in that. I don't see it as a single block item to say this is about a red ocean. We're competing over who owns this success case. I'm more of let's lean into the blue ocean side of well, what are we missing in capturing that how, that why? Why did these things work together that well? I don't know. The data interoperability is probably the biggest challenge there to say each system isn't communicating well with it. And like, what's the market incentive for us to partnership? Like for us, it's the best outcome for the service member. For an employer partner, what is their incentive to partner? I'm not sure. Like it would depend on their needs, their outcomes. But like if we want to measure job satisfaction, we can only do that through one lens, which is our approach to the user. Compiling that data with what the company is measuring from their side would get to a richer picture, but there has to be a uniform incentive around that collaboration versus a fighting for resources approach towards who owns X success. Like, I think for this market to work, we can't be in competition about that. We have to be leaning into where does collaboration produce opportunity. Sorry, I need some water up here.
And I think transparency and transparency plays a big role in this too, and standardization of the data outcomes. If we were all using similar surveys to measure the effectiveness, surveying that one customer who got the job on if they were taught how to fish correctly by one organization or the other, how more comfortable they felt with that process or the other, that could be a way that we could hopefully standardize across the community. Having been a leader of an employment NGO in the past, of course, working with Ross and James and many others in the past, we really focused on that post-experience, that post-hire outcome measurement evaluation. And I think there's some opportunity for standardization. Megan, we talk about standardizing on the SDOH space, right, Gilly? But also SDOH, one of the biggest health-related social needs in the continuum in the veteran journey is employment, right? And that's in the transition. So I think that there could be, there are leaders in this room, whether that's the federal government, maybe, but NGOs like Hire Heroes USA or Wounded Warrior Project are hiring our heroes. Those are great stewards of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. So can I add a quick data point there too, though? I think it's important. We talked about the one-on-one counseling that's inherently important to that transition process. When we look at our 60-plus partners who are Employment Navigator Partnership Program partners, that's a lot. Right? So we're looking at if someone uses an Employment Navigator Partnership Program partner, they're claiming unemployment insurance at a lesser rate than someone who only goes through TAP. Roughly about 3.6% compared to 7.6% who do not utilize EMPP, right? They're getting higher wages as soon as they separate, and they're getting them earlier, 2 to 3 months earlier than someone who did not use an Employment Navigator Partnership Program. And that is inherently important. But the key to that is the continuation of developing new partners, right, who are in various industries, but also the sustainability of that in itself. And sustaining those partnerships and those programs are inherently important. And that's where we have to continue to look at how do we, again, manage our budget for all the things that we want to do and grow, but how do we manage that in the environment we're currently in? But looking at data from the National Database of New Hires, which is the most current information that you can get, is giving us a lot of good insight and a lot of ability to look at all the data, analyze that, and figure out how we can continue to improve our programs. And so from a labor standpoint, getting people to the labor market earlier, getting them to the right industries, is inherently important, and ensuring that their wages also commensurate to the type of skill sets that they have when they transition out of the military. But it all revolves around our partnerships. And we want to take that information. We want to grow our programs, but at a certain point, we have to look at what we can actually do based off of budgetary constraints too. So we have to be honest about that part.
I'm cognizant that I want to put my RAND researcher hat on and say something about designing experiments to implement different policy things, but I'll leave it to my colleague Jeff Winger to maybe talk about that with folks during the break. I had hoped to get to another question, but I'm cognizant that Congressman Takano's here, and I want to be aware of keeping us on time. Thank you so much to the panelists for coming and representing your space and your sector within the employment transition, something I think we all care about and love if we're in this room. And how about if you join me in a round of applause for our panelists?
Yeah, well. All right, thank you to our amazing panel. That was an incredible conversation. I think we could have continued that for a long time, and hopefully we will at the break. But now I'd like to, we're very thrilled to welcome Congressman Mark Takano to offer some remarks. Congressman Takano has been a tireless advocate for our nation's veterans, as I'm sure you are all well aware. He represents the 39th District of California and is a ranking member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, where he sits on the Subcommittee for Economic Opportunity. So, Congressman Takano.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to join you at the National Press Club. The RAND Corporation, the RAND Veterans Policy Research Institute, has long been a partner of our committee, and we've even hired some of your staff away to work with us. As many of you probably know, service member transition has been a long-time focus of mine and of the committee. And the year before I took over as chairman, we included improvements to the Transition Assistance Program in the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. We changed the law to make it so that all service members would start their transition process a year before they left the service, and would have a more tailored week of resources for the lives they are preparing to lead. It was a significant improvement, in part made possible because of the research from RAND. So I want to thank you for that. However, 5 years later, it is clear that more improvements are needed and that the Department of Defense is failing to fulfill the intent of the current law. Some of that was due to COVID-19, but there are likely other factors. Congress can write all the laws that we want, but if the agencies do not implement them, then what's the point? And if DoD cannot or will not fully implement the program, maybe it's time to further empower VA and DOL vets to take a greater hold of the process. Additionally, our committee needs to continue working with VSOs on further improvements to the process that go beyond what was included in the 2019 NDAA. In this year's NDAA, we have requested language for a National Guard and Reserve specific transition track and programming. We're also offering Representative Levin's TIER Act as an amendment to add more individualized risk and counseling factors. Now, going forward, I'd like to see a shift to a more personalized experience for service members, not a one-size-fits-all week of classes. The work in this space is critically important. Failures in transition can lead to serious problems for veterans. Fewer job opportunities, predatory for-profit schools, wasting hard-earned GI benefits, and in some cases, homelessness and death by suicide. However, if we can get service member transition right, the next generation will see the value and opportunity that comes with uniformed service. We make a commitment to those who take the oath to protect our country, and that commitment is that we will take care of you when you come home, and we will pay for the costs of war. Now, as we approach the 80th anniversary of President Roosevelt signing the original GI Bill into law, let us remember that it was drafted to help reintegrate transitioning service members back into civil society and close the gap with their civilian peers. We must keep working to live up to that ideal. Now, I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but as my predecessor, Governor Walz, former congressman and former ranking member of the committee, he used to like to say, sometimes the choir needs to sing louder. And by the way, I was just with Governor Walz over the weekend on Saturday in Paris. We were there for another 80th anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the landing at Normandy. I got to tell you, that was an amazing, inspirational event, as it always is. 5 years ago, I was there for the 75th. Perhaps the most touching moment for me was when President Macron went before, I'd say, 10 to 15 centenarians and there was a drama involved in each moment that he had that veteran stand up, struggling out of the wheelchair, assisted often by others, as he conferred the honor of the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. And he kissed a veteran on both cheeks. And at one point, with an African-American veteran, he placed the palm of his hand on his cheek, and that was very meaningful to my African-American colleagues. It was, I think most of us in the audience were on the verge of tears, if not really tearing up at seeing these men struggle to get their award. You know, it brought to mind that greatest generation and why all of us here in this room do what we do. So I want to thank you for the work that you do. I want to thank you for the ongoing work in this particular area of veteran policy. And I look forward to continuing our productive relationship for years to come. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Congressman. That was great. Thank you for the panel. We're going to take our break a little bit early. The breakfast is still out, so if people didn't have a chance to get something to eat, please do. We'll be back after the break, and all of our researchers will be available to answer your questions. Peruse the table of our publications outside, but we'll come back here at the regular scheduled time at 10:35. You heard 95% of resources are spent on education benefits, so we thought it really important to have a discussion about those benefits and the role that education plays in supporting service members as they transition out of the military. So we'll see you back in a few minutes. Thanks. All right, thanks everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed the break. Again, this is like just a continuation of the discussion that we've already had, and themes have been already raised about the role of education and education benefits in supporting service members' transitions out of the military. And so we have really an esteemed panel here today to talk about that with us. James Ruhlman is Deputy Director for Project Management with the Veterans Benefit Administration's Education Service. Jared Lyon is the National President and Chief Executive Officer of Student Veterans in America. So thanks, Jared, for being here. Amber Bloomfield is Senior Data Scientist at the American Institutes for Research. And Mike Haney is Vice Chancellor for Strategic Initiatives and Innovation at Syracuse University. And the panel will be moderated by our RAND colleague, Darlene Otford. Darlene is Vice President and Director of the RAND Education and Labor and holds the Distinguished Chair of Education Policy at RAND. Thanks, Darlene.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to welcome our panelists to this discussion. As with the last panel, if we could sort of go across and talk about why you're here talking about education today for veterans.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Bloomfield and Senior Data Scientist at American Institutes for Research. And the reason that I'm here today is because I had the tremendous privilege and exciting opportunity to perform data analyses with a data set that was only possible because of a partnership between VA, VBA, Census, IRS, National Student Clearinghouse, and all of these data that were able to come together so that we could investigate PGIB usage, post-secondary completion, and workforce outcomes for all PGIB eligible veterans from 2009 to 2019. So that's what I'm here to do today, is talk a little bit about that.
So hi, I'm Jared Lyon. I full-time serve as the President and CEO of Student Veterans of America. And we are a student-centric, chapter-based organization for military veterans, military-connected students, family members, caregivers, and survivors that head back to school. That notwithstanding, we operate 1,647 chapters in all 50 states, U.S. territories, and 3 countries overseas, where we currently have just over 754,000 student veterans going to school, which is actually more veterans than are accessing benefits. So just to sort of know that not all veterans use their benefits. On a personal note, I'm actually a full-time PhD student at Syracuse University, and I'm a third year, so I'm through coursework, thank goodness. And I'm combining data science and economics to study the national security implications of an educated populace.
I'm James Ruhlman, Deputy Director for Program Management at VA's Education Service. and we administer the various GI Bill education programs. First and foremost, the post 9/11 GI Bill, which has already been mentioned, and we deliver about $10 billion or so in education benefits per year to hundreds of thousands of individuals. On a personal note, I have been with VA for 23 years now, all of it within education, starting out in the call center and working my way up to where I am today.
And again, Mike Haney, you heard I'm the Vice Chancellor at Syracuse University. Probably more relevant to this conversation, I'm also an Air Force veteran. My transition out of military service was actually directly from teaching at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I had the good fortune the Air Force sent me off to earn my PhD while I was on active duty, directly then to a role as a professor at Syracuse University, and started doing work in the veteran space almost immediately upon arriving at Syracuse, and a little more than a decade ago founded the Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse. And have to thank Jared for the brand and marketing he's doing with the socks he's wearing for
That was for you, Mike.
my institute.
It's for you.
So
No sucking up at all.
I have to give him a little name, image, and likeness deal after this event, so he's compensated
NIL,
appropriately.
there we go.
Very good. As we heard earlier, the majority of federal dollars are dedicated to education and training programs. But when we think about transition, the focus is often on employment. So what's your perspective, and this is open to the panel, what's your perspective on the role of education in transition?
Well, I'll start off. I think that it plays an important role. When individuals are transitioning from active duty into veteran status, they may require some sort of training or retraining, depending upon what it is they want to do. Some of them really enjoyed or loved what they did in the service, and they want to continue doing the same thing afterwards, which means they could use their education benefits for something like licensure or certifications, which will help them to obtain employment within that field. Some of them may be ready right out of the box from the training and certifications and credentialing they got within the military. Others may decide they want to do something completely different, and this is a pathway for them to gain those skills in order to go into some other career field. So I think it enables them more than anything. It's not, it doesn't automatically end in employment for most people most of the time. Most of our beneficiaries are going into degree programs, which aren't quite as, geared towards obtaining employment out of the back end like vocational or career schools are, but it is enabling them to gain those skills that they need in order to obtain employment in the career field of their choice.
I'd build on that a little bit to say that in three different ways it helps. First is to understand the front end of coming into the military. The majority of people that will ever come into the military are like me, they'll enlist, they won't commission. And of those who are enlisting in the armed forces since 2011, the most common motivation for service, for an enlistment, is the opportunity for an education post-military. Of those that achieve an education, just about 70% of them are also like me, first persons in their family to ever go to school. So they are a first-generation college student. So that's sort of where they're coming from on the front end. When we understand that in the context of intent, and we're here talking policy too, like the intent of Congress is useful to know. And the original intent of the Service Misery Adjustment Act of 1944, though it didn't really achieve it for all those that were eligible, I jotted down the quote from Harry W. Comary in his testimony to Congress because I think it's really powerful in anchoring the understanding of it. He said that economic freedom, the opportunity to earn a competent livelihood for oneself and those dependent upon them, is the very cornerstone upon which the other freedoms and liberties depend. Consequently, it is the most important thing that we can restore that opportunity to those who have sacrificed it on our behalf. And so when we sort of think about the role that education can play, it's certainly that in transition, it's certainly that in earned benefit, but it's also into reintegration and reassimilation into society as well. I think it provides some context in all three of those categories.
Which way are we going? You know, so, I think one of the, I'll try to do this brief, but it's a roundabout way of getting at your question. I think I've been doing this work for now 17 years, and I think one of the things that is often frustrating is we use this word transition without defining what it means. And, if you're truly going to study something, you have to start by defining what the construct that you're studying. And, here and very often, we implicitly define transition as a job. We define it in vocational outcomes. And, that has not been my experience. And what I mean by that is if you think about, I draw a very dark line between upskilling, credentialing, workforce training programs, where there I'm very comfortable defining the outcome as a job, a better job. I'm much less comfortable when we talk about education and categorizing education as a transition program where the outcome beginning and ends with a job. And it's sort of the reason being is sort of along the lines of what Jared was describing. And Meredith, I think when she was up here, alluded to this. There's no better institution on the planet that is skilled at confounding one's identity and sense of self with an organization than the United States military. And if you think about this idea of transition, it's not just from a job to a job. It's also from an identity to an identity. And we don't spend enough time thinking about and resourcing and enacting in the context of transition. When I hear from service members, veterans, about their transition, they don't lead with the job. They lead with, trying to find that new sense of purpose and meaning. I'm trying to fit in. I moved every 3 years. All of a sudden I have a community that I want to connect to. I have a family that I want to situate. And, my point is I think we do a disservice talking about transition strictly through the lens of employment, when if we're going to get it right, we have to holistically embrace all that is involved in the context of what is a very discontinuous life transition, not a normal, I'm going from Procter & Gamble to General Mills kind of job change. It's a very different thing. And I don't put traditional education in that bucket for the very reason. If you look at sociologists, anthropologists have studied the original GI Bill, and for all through the 50s and 60s. And most would argue that the biggest benefit of the GI Bill wasn't money to go to college, it wasn't money to buy a house or start a business. It was leveraging that legislation as a way to reconnect those who have served with civilian society and their communities and their neighbors and situate those families. So I think for me, that's what I think about when I think about the GI Bill and the powerful benefit that it confers to those who have the opportunity to take advantage of it.
And Amber?
Yes. So in our analyses, we didn't look at all of the aspects of transition. So I'm going to speak from the data that we had, which was looking at completion and also their workforce outcomes. And I will say that similar to what we see for the general population, earning an associate's degree, you have better workforce outcomes, better wages than if you didn't. Bachelor's degree, you have better wages than if you earned an associate's degree. It's consistent amongst the veterans as it is in the general population. So in terms of meeting a goal of transition, of having a good job and earning a good wage, education is meeting that need.
Great, thank you. It's kind of interesting that in listening to all of your comments, sometimes you allude to the post 9/11 GI Bill as being a transition program, or it's an earned benefit, or it's even a recruitment tool. And so I guess the question I have is, what is it? Is it everything or is it one thing? And then given what it is, what do we need to be monitoring to know that it's being effective or not? So Amber, I want to start with you this time.
You got the data.
I'll take a stab. So I think it can be all three of those things, which I realize is kind of a punt of an answer, but I think that that's definitely true. There are people who enlist because those benefits are there, and it is a way to earn better wages, so it is a transition. I would say that one of the things that we should be aware of in our analyses, we found that the Black and American Indian Alaskan Native groups of veterans were more likely to use their PGIB benefits than average, but they were less likely to complete. And they also had, given that they had completed a degree, they earned less. So, and this is probably not a shock to anyone. These are the same patterns we see in the general American population. But we need to make the benefits work better for those individuals because they're not working as well for them.
When you look at it as to which of the three, I don't view it as a punt at all to say it's all three. And all three can be true at the same time. One of the things when we talk about transition, Mike, I think you're spot on with regards to the ability to define it. If you're moving from one role in a company and then you're switching companies, but you're doing something similar, either a little above what you previously did it or a little below, that's a transition. But if you're coming out of, say, the military in an enlisted situation, and then you're transitioning to the civilian workforce, you are more likely than not going to do something completely different. And all the things that we talk about in employment come down to usually transition skills translators. I was a this in the Army, I should be able to be a this in the civilian world. And what we find is that over the course of one's career post-military, particularly for the enlisted population, that nearly 90% of prior enlisted folks are going to do something post-military that had little to nothing to do with what they did in the military. Well, how can that be? When you enlist, you choose what you're going to do. Sure, you kind of do, right? You get to choose when you enlist. That notwithstanding, do you know what the number one motivator for the choice you make about the job you'll do in the armed forces? It's ship date to basic training. That has the biggest influence on the job you choose. And so it shouldn't be any misunderstanding that that would be what you'd want to do post-military, because especially for the post-9/11 generation, we didn't choose the military to gain a skill. We chose the military for service. We chose the military for what it could do for us post-military. And then we did the job we were asked to do, whether we chose it or not. And so if we think about it from a transition perspective, just the data in and of itself demonstrates the need to find what's next. And lastly, I'd say from an identity perspective, when you look at identity research, I think far too often we paint veterans as a monolith, that one veteran is the same as all veterans from every branch, et cetera. The unique thing about identity research is it demonstrates that veterans themselves, it's not so much an identity as it is a lived experience. And so when we think about it, we treat it like an identity, and yet it is more of a lived experience. We go right over the heads of the very individuals that we're trying to better serve. And when we look at the most vulnerable amongst our population and where we should be placing resources, those with the most deficit, it does come down to the junior enlisted force. So I beat one drum regularly. It's not that I don't love officers, I do. Mike, you were a great officer, but I was enlisted, and that's the experience of
Maybe
most.
you'll get that degree.
Maybe. Comps in the fall.
I would agree with my colleagues. I think that GI Bill education benefits in the post-9/11 GI Bill does sort of fit in all three buckets. From an administrative standpoint, I will say that mostly it is an earned benefit. It's an entitlement program. And it really goes right back to the original legislation creating the post-9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance in Public Law 110-252 in Section 5002. It goes through some findings of Congress. It ends at number 6, and it says, for all these reasons, there's a need for an enhanced educational assistance benefit program on par with the benefits provided to the World War II generation. So ultimately, it's an entitlement program. Eligible individuals apply. There are approved programs, they enroll, and we pay benefits. However, we certainly see it as a way to make that adjustment, both in terms of gaining the skills and utilizing the various resources and services that are provided in order to successfully transition into civilian life and a civilian career.
Great.
I'll hedge less, not less, I don't mean that less than you, but it's a benefit. I think it's a really slippery slope to start talking about the GI Bill, particularly for DOD. It's because you touch the GI Bill, you start, considering it as a transition program, an employment program, leads to conversations that have happened over the years about, oh, we're going to put constraints on degrees veterans can pursue, we're going to start, you start doing that. And if you think the all-volunteer force is in trouble today, wait and see what happens when the thing that is the strongest motivator today for young people today to volunteer to serve, the opportunity in the absence of the financial means for them to do it on their own without taking out debt, you take that away, you put constraints on it, and the all-volunteer force is in real trouble. So that's why I'm very strongly in the benefit camp.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-up of Jared and Amber, since both of you said it's all three. That makes it difficult to determine whether or not it's successful. So how do you think about, since it is all three, how do you think about how we would measure or evaluate success across those three things?
You're smarter than me.
Let's see. I would say that you can look at the three purposes separately, and you can examine data like we've examined data to see if it's paying off the way it should be, given that that's the lever you're expecting it to function as. As a benefit, the metric for that would be the satisfaction of the veterans with what they gave and what they got, right? We didn't have those data, but I believe those data exist somewhere. And in terms of the transition, again, the numbers that I brought up, certainly earning degrees using the benefits are getting them better wages, so transition, check. And in terms of recruitment, we wouldn't want to take it away to test that. We don't need to have an empirical test of it, but you were speaking about the surveys of why people enlist, and it's there. So it is operating in all three capacities.
Okay.
I'll give you the comparison without having to take it away. Your control can be all volunteer force, so 1974, to Montgomery GI Bill, 83, 84. Look at the armed forces then, and then compare that to how we talk about recruitment today. We are singing the same song. Young Americans do not want to choose the ability to go and serve in the armed forces. In the 70s and into the early 80s, we had the myth that exists for the post 9/11 generation, which is choose jail or the Army, right? Like, we did all that once before a GI Bill. And we looked at the quality of individuals willing to serve as being lower. It's not an indictment on who is willing to, but in the post 9/11 era, we find that the majority of Americans are not eligible to serve in the armed forces, even if they wanted to. These are individuals choosing something that the rest of society is passing by because of the access to other opportunities. We have more eligible and highly qualified Americans that we're looking for to serve in a more technical armed forces to prepare for whatever fight comes tomorrow. This is not a population that we're looking to have be less educated. But I'll just go down the three categories, but I just thought that was a unique control because we had an all-volunteer force without a GI Bill for nearly a decade. Look at that and compare it to today. If you want the same, those are your results. That notwithstanding, if you look at it from a benefit, A benefit is something much akin to like the VA home loan is a benefit. That's an earned benefit for the opportunity for a home, to purchase and own a home. The opportunity for an education is simple math. About 37% of adult Americans over the age of 25 possess a bachelor's degree or higher. Do veterans beat that or meet it? They exceed it by a lot. So as a benefit from its access perspective, you can measure it there. Let's look at it from a transition. From a transition perspective, what we see is that veterans that complete a bachelor's degree are overwhelmingly enlisted, but it shouldn't be misunderstood that those that are prior officers don't also get bachelor's degrees. We assume they all get masters. About 41% of officers that access a GI Bill after military service get a second bachelor's degree, not a master's degree. What are the top 3 undergraduate majors for the active duty military corps? Right now in this order: political science, criminal justice, and history. What are the top 3 undergraduates that enlisted veterans start in? Those 3. I'm a social science person. I'm not dogging those degrees, but what do enlisted veterans graduate in? Business, STEM, and health-related fields at nearly 56% of all PGI Bill members graduating in that. And so when we look at it from a transition, they are finding their way. So do they graduate in something that they define as providing purpose? And then lastly, from employment, this is what's so misunderstood. The GI Bill and accessing it isn't an either or. It's either I'm going to go to school or I'm going to enter the workforce. It's both. Fully 74% of veterans that use the post 9/11 GI Bill are going to be working full or part-time while they are students. And that's because 52% of them are in a committed relationship with children, and nearly 20% are single parents. And so while they are in school, they are working. But the top 2 industries that they work in while getting degrees in business, STEM, and health-related fields are service and retail. Now, I'm not, again, dogging those positions, but if you graduate with something that you have more to offer in the workforce after, how can we better align career opportunities while you're a student with the degree that you're majoring in, so that you're gaining not just the degree, but industry experience during the period in which you are a student veteran as well?
Great, thanks. Mike, I'm going to direct a question to you, because you talked about this being a benefit, education being a benefit. You're from Syracuse University. It's considered a really good school for veterans because of the support provided to them and also the research that you do in your institute on them and their families. How does Syracuse think about supporting veteran students?
Yeah, so there's 2. So we have about 6% of our degree-enrolled student population today are what we call military-connected. Jared, I heard recently you don't like that term. But active duty guard, reserve, veterans, or military kids. But we also have on the IVMF does research, but we also have a very big programmatic arm of what we do. Put about 23,000 transitioning service members, veterans a year through vocational programs that we run: credentialing, certification, upskilling, business ownership, career preparation. 2 different populations. What we do on the institute side programmatically is exactly what the kind of stuff we've been talking about here all day. It's upskilling. It's where the goal is a job. On the degree-enrolled student program and population, it's a very different thing because we do embrace this idea of leveraging traditional higher education as a way to more fundamentally hit the reset button, if you will. I think another one of the longstanding assumptions in the context of these conversations that happen often in DC is this direct correlation between what you did in the military and then what you're going to do when you take that uniform off. And the reality is, if you talk to many service members and veterans, that's not what they're looking to do. And I think what we're able to do in the context of traditional higher education very well is open the universe of possibilities broadly to that particular population. I think now I'll sit up here and also be very critical of my own industry, if you will. Candidly, I think traditional higher education has actually done a pretty crappy job over the course of the last 20 years, opening their doors broadly to military-connected students. You know, it is so frustrating. I remember a few years back at an annual meeting of the American Council on Education, we had finally, and this is where all university chancellors, presidents, provosts come together, we had finally convinced them after many years to hold a session on veterans and how, you know, the idea of how their universities could benefit from being more welcoming to this population. Big ballroom. We didn't need a big ballroom, we need one round table because 12 people showed up. You know, the reality is I know empirically that these students make us a better institution. You know, as an example, you know, 2 years ago, at a reception for our new student veterans, I ended up talking to a young man, big as a house, 6'5", you know, young enlisted, or formerly now enlisted soldier. 3 weeks prior to showing up at Syracuse as a freshman biology major, he was a squad leader up at the 10th Mountain Division. And I asked him casually where he was living, and he said, "Oh, I'm in a such and such a dorm." And I'm like, "Oh, you know, we made a mistake. You know, we put him in a freshman dorm, and even though he was academically a freshman, you know, we would typically put him in a graduate student housing." And he's like, "You know, I was going to fix it." He said, "No, don't worry about it. You know, they caught it." But I said, I'm happy to stay. And I was like, "What do you mean you're happy to stay?" And he said, he told me he had an 18-year-old roommate. And he said, "The best thing I've ever heard." And he said, "The Army taught me how to lead 18-year-olds. I can figure I can lead 18-year-olds at Syracuse University too." That's what you get with this population. My colleagues, my peers leading large American universities have yet to figure that out.
Great, thanks. Jared, you mentioned that the majority of student veterans are balancing their education with working at the same time. How do you see them doing that balance between work and education?
Remarkably well, almost unbelievably so. In that way, there's, Mike, a thread I want to pull just slightly. So I want to take you back to when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was Mike Mullen. So there was a paper written inside the DoD to help transition, like what was the path, what was the strategy going to be? And it was institutions of higher learning. That was viewed as the best opportunity, not dissimilar from the recommendations that the RAND report makes. You know, to listen to somebody like Vice Chancellor Haney talk from an institution like Syracuse, and to know what his equivalents around the country show a very weird sense, and I don't think it's from malice, but you know, I travel around the country and talk to university leaders, and when I do, there's almost this like interesting part of the conversation where they look over both shoulders and they say, "Well, Jared, if, you know, I mean, let's be honest, if veterans were smart enough to get into college, how'd they wind up in the military?" There's still this sentiment that exists that the military is something you wind up in versus something that you've chosen. And we should stand on that. Now, it's not a criticism to Admiral Mullen and his team in focusing on this. What shifted their focus was the unemployment compensation challenges that DoD had to pay out, right? So they shifted it to employment, and that's what we talked about. We didn't resource it from a dollars and cents perspective, but you know, even with the conversation that was happening earlier, DoD is talking to employers, and they should be. They should continue to talking to employers. They should be talking to the equivalents of a Mike Haney, too. They should be talking as much to those individuals as they do to employers. And if you look at the biggest funders of research in the United States, it's the federal government. They are funding these very institutions for R&D and incredible advancements in health and science. And if we also talk to them about the quality that comes out of the military that could be students at their institutions and then be returned to the workforce, it's helpful. But how are they faring while they're working? They're faring incredibly well despite kind of being condescended to on a regular basis. They're questioned why they belong, and all they are desperately seeking is a sense of belonging, a sense of worth in this new transition, as most likely a person of color, a woman, a person with a disability, somebody who is the first of their family to go back to school. These are all the people that when we look at the opportunity for an education, that we should be desperately seeking how to get more of it. And we have such a wide, vast amount of it within the transitioning service member population that we should be looking for more because they can handle it, they do exceptionally well once they're provided the opportunity, and they go on to leave exceptionally productive lives post-graduation as members of our workforce.
Great. You know, when we talk about employers, we often talk about them in terms of jobs and in workforce kinds of issues. But more and more often what we're seeing is that employers are both recognizing certificate programs that are from outside, and in many cases they're actually encouraging people to do certificate programs as a way to progress in their career. So I want to ask, what role should employers be playing in the sort of education of veterans? I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Well, yeah, so one, back to the point that I think Jared and I were both making, and I've long said this to our employer partners, you want to change culture in higher education related to veterans, employers need to start demanding that the colleges and universities they recruit from tee up veterans graduating from those because that'll change culture. Because every one of those colleges and universities, ultimately, their rankings are largely, significantly influenced by where they place their graduates. And therefore, those employer relationships with universities are very, very important to university leaders. So if you want, it's not what I would like the solution to be, because I'd like it to be an acknowledgement of the value that our service members, veterans bring to the academic community on a college campus. But if you want to change culture, employers should start demanding from the colleges and universities they recruit from that every single year they're teeing up a pipeline of veterans graduating from those institutions. To your point about the credentials, though, this is also, I think, an existential moment for higher education. We have seen over the course of the last few years, major U.S. employers review every job role that they have, asking the question, starting with the question, does this job really require a four-year degree? Mm-hmm. And if the answer to that question is no, eliminating that requirement in favor of a credential or a certification. And I really think already now, but more so even into the future, credentials and certifications is going to become the currency of the contemporary labor market. And you know, for our service members, it makes there's a huge opportunity there, both to realize the best of both worlds. Credentialing opportunities can be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a near-term transition to a well-paying job, but at the same time leveraging that GI Bill benefit to pursue sort of the vocational reset and the life trajectory career path moving forward.
Yeah. James, same question. How do you think about employers and education?
Sure. I think employers are important in education, in part because sometimes they're directly involved in providing the training itself. We do pay benefits for on-the-job training as well as registered apprenticeship programs registered by the Department of Labor. So those are definitely employer-driven because they're actually the ones providing the instruction and the training on the job for a number of important fields that we need individuals for all the time, whether that's something like an electrician or HVAC. There's so many different types of occupations can leverage that. We have people who go to the police academy and then do OJT as a police officer, as a patrolman, firefighters, so many different places. And we think that that's something which generally when people look at those numbers, and it tends to be a small percentage of individuals in that, there's almost this feeling that it's sort of underutilized. And part of it is trying to get the message out to employers. Hey, how would you like to participate? How would you like to be approved for post 9/11 GI Bill benefits or GI Bill benefits in general? One of course, the big differences are for post 9/11, if it's college or university, we will pay tuition and fees directly to the school. For OJT and apprenticeship, we don't pay any money directly to the employer. They get paperwork requirements, basically. So that, I think, is part of what's hard about it. But employers are really important. I think they're going to drive the types of benefits that veterans and dependents use. As was just mentioned, as employers move away from the need to have a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree in order to get a job, then we may see additional people use their benefits instead of going to a 4-year school and getting a bachelor's degree, going to a 6-month certificate program, or using their benefits that we can also pay for reimbursement of a licensing and certification exam, and that's going to be important as well. Finally, I would also say that we had a pilot, which was part of the Cole-Mary Act, which was a high technology pilot, the Vet Tech program, which actually geared the payments of the educational institution based upon certain benchmarks. They got 25% at enrollment, 25% at graduation, and the last 50% of tuition and fees if the individual got a job within 180 days of graduation. So now all of a sudden we had these training providers who were enrolling individuals based upon their aptitudes and ability and likelihood of completing the program and actively assisting them in obtaining employment on the back end. And we work closely with the program providers. We also set up an employer consortium where we got the word out to major employers in the high-tech fields to know that we have these graduates coming out, these veterans out of the Vet Tech program, and actually focusing more on not just education, but the actual employment piece as well. So the employers have become a lot more important as we've seen different types of programs, and we'd love to see them play a role in the future as well. And I think they will be continuing to guide and gearing sort of the direction that our beneficiaries are going to go in because of changes in what they're looking for in those hires.
Can I
Okay, I'm
Can
going
I add
to
to that real quick?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So from an employer's perspective, to echo what's been said, employers have gotten really good at going to the gates. And I mean that they go to the base where people are getting out. But the vast majority of people that get out are not going to stick around where that base is. They're going to go home to where they or their significant other is from. And so I encourage employers to a bit more skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. And to understand that equally as important of meeting folks at the transition at the gate, and that's not for retirees. I'm talking about people that serve a short period of time and then separate. But to also understand that in your non-degreed roles, college and university campuses, be they at the 2-year programs or 4-year programs or graduate programs, is where you can find well-qualified veterans who Uncle Sam is paying for their education, but they still have a need to work to support their family because we're still in need of comprehensive GI Bill reform. And until it covers all expenses, these individuals work while they are. And so if employers could match that talent where their jobs are, near campuses, in the degree fields that individuals are pursuing, they will have folks that have been retained in their company in a role and then promoted once they finish their degree. I know that might be somewhat idealistic, but it's a heck of a higher concentration of individuals than the 11% or so of individuals that want to do something post-military than what they did in the military. Go to where there's a bigger pond of fish to fish in, and that's going to be near college and university campuses.
Great. Yeah, and I was going to make the broad statement that inequality. I was just pointing out that the wage gap between Black and American Indian, Alaskan Native, and average earnings still present for veterans, despite controlling for a very large number of variables that one would say, well, but maybe this, but maybe this. No, 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 even controlling for that. Same thing for women compared to men. And one thing that employers can do is they can pay equitably, right? So I know that's kind of a swing, but
on data for that because it's so helpful. For student veterans that are working while they're in school, white men work the least. And then for every demographic that you change beyond white men, there is an increased need to work. The group that works second most is non-white men, so as broad as you can define it. Then it is I apologize, white women, but women of color, nearly 90% of them are working full or part-time while they are students. And that is because of family obligations and added societal pressures that lead to these underrepresented groups not benefiting from the benefit the same as everybody else. And that's, again, our continuous desire to treat veterans as a monolith, and we're not.
Yeah. James, I'm going to ask you, one of the things we've heard in many of the answers from the panel is just the number or different types of places where veterans can use their benefits. So how does the VBA think about quality between, four-year degrees, certificates, other options? Yeah.
That's kind of a big question. There are a few parts to that. I would start out by saying that we absolutely support having a number of options for veterans and dependents because, as Jared mentioned pretty early on, veterans are not a monolith. Right. They're different. They have different aptitudes, different interests, different desires, different preferences, and different goals. Some of them want office jobs, other ones want something in a shop using their hands, other ones want to be outdoors. So we do focus on ensuring that we have broad coverage, and we work closely with our state approving agency partners who ensure that programs do meet program approval requirements. There's a number of requirements for accredited programs, but that tends to be the easiest threshold because the accreditors are keeping track of certain quality requirements. And then the non-accredited programs involve a much more thorough review by our state approving agency partners to make sure that they are similar in content quality and length as accredited programs. And we do oversight and compliance reviews of those programs to make sure that there is still adherence and compliance with those program approval requirements. And really, from the veteran side, what we want to focus on is making sure that they can try and make a good choice as far as this big sort of wide-ranging array of programs that they could go into. What is it that's making them decide to do this versus that? Is it something that they heard about, something that they read about? We offer a number of options to help them make those decisions on how to use their benefits. We offer the PCPG, which is the Personalized Career Planning and Guidance, which is the Chapter 36 counseling services, which can help point them in the right direction. We offer a number of resources online, including how to choose a school, Know Before You Go videos. We have a GI Bill comparison tool that allows them to research schools, compare schools regarding the costs, the type of accreditation they have, whether or not they participate in Title IV education benefits in case they would need additional funding. It also has caution flags if there are some risk factors that may be possessed by those institutions as well. So we do, with our SAA partners, try and make sure that they are quality programs, but ultimately that decision is up to the individual, because we're not here to micromanage or say this degree is good, this vocation's bad, this school's good, that school's bad. As was mentioned earlier, that would, of course, have some consequences on recruiting on the DoD side as well. And let's face it, there's nothing in the statute in those approval requirements that actually deals with parsing between different types of programs other than do they meet these approval requirements.
Amber, you are in the middle of a big evaluation of the post 9/11 GI Bill. You released a report recently talking about education outcomes, labor market participation, and earnings. Where are you going next?
So, hey, it's back, yay. So we have a number of additional reports that are coming that I would love to tell you all about now, but approvals are still happening. But I can give you a foreshadowing. We looked at how people who skip using the PGI Bill fare compared to people who use the PGI Bill, so really zeroing in on those folks. We also do a qualitative analysis asking veterans who skipped using the PGI Bill why they did it. Maybe they're planning on using it in the future, but to dig into why that happened. We do some deep dive analyses for specifically Black veterans, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Hispanic veterans to look at the variables that matter within those groups for both their uptake of PGIB, their post-secondary completion, and their wage outcomes. And we do look at institutional characteristics and outcomes for veterans. So all of that is forthcoming. But yeah, we have a lot of exciting stuff to talk about.
So stay tuned.
Yes, please.
Okay, at this point, we have a few minutes to open it up for questions from the floor. There's one over here. Wait for the mic, it's coming.
Sorry, this might be specifically for Jared. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you mentioned comprehensive GI Bill reform, and I wondered what's on your top 5 list.
It is a wish list. So there's simple things like understanding Guard and Reserve parity. Every day in uniform should count equally, regardless. That's a low-hanging piece of fruit. But it's also things like looking at monthly housing allowance. When we talk about the post 9/11 GI Bill does provide tuition, fees, and then things like the housing. Housing for individuals that rent is not counted towards the ability to rent. So many student veterans that don't own their homes but rent are quite literally having to get permission slips signed by someone in their family to say that they can be an okay person to rent. But it's also things like the book stipend. The book stipend is $1,000 and has been for 14, 15 years, something like that. So just literally looking at the cost of education and adjusted for inflation. But then it's even bigger things, bigger ideas and understandings. If you look all the way back to the original intent of the GI Bill, how do you very quickly help somebody get through education? Well, back in 1944, about 7% of the adult population had a bachelor's degree or higher in education. Today, it's nearly 4 times that, and yet we haven't made significant adjustments to our assumptions of what it takes in a modern era for the contemporary veteran and their family to complete an education in a shortened and condensed period of time. It'd sort of be things all the way around, so try to answer it as comprehensively as I could.
Great. Anyone else?
I wanted to say thank you to everybody. And Jared, so there's something you mentioned at the very beginning regarding that junction of national security and education and how that support structure happens, because it got me kind of thinking, when a veteran transitions, what their long-term contribution is to the defense industrial base, to defense workforce, veteran-owned small businesses that support our contracting base, and how does education kind of support that larger mission? So I was just curious if that's areas that have been considered in the veteran transition process.
Thank you in advance for the opportunity to geek out. So if you look at it from a labor perspective, we often talk about the skills gap. It's important to talk about that. And numbers that you'll hear most regularly cited are nearly 1.7 million jobs in skilled labor go unfilled every year. But an area we don't talk enough about, I think, especially with its implications to national security, is the degree gap. So as we look at the demographic cliff that higher education finds itself quickly approaching, you have to understand that we produce about 343,000 fewer bachelor's degrees than are needed every year just to replace boomers currently in the workforce. And we don't pay enough attention to that. And so as we look beyond just the military-industrial complex and that base, we just look at the national security implications of an educated workforce that's not able to replace itself. And that is broadly because as we look at birth rates in the US, we are on a steady decline. I'm a millennial, born in 1982, so I'm an elder millennial, but still a millennial nonetheless. And my partner and I only have 2 children. Many in our generation and those generations coming behind us are not having children as readily because we don't talk openly about things like childcare and the like in its importance to the labor market. And so if we continue to only focus on the skills gap that exists in the skills trades and not also equally look at our ability to replace the degree gap that exists, we're heading for some really problematic times in the 2030s that, you know, I think keeps my research relevant, but we should wake up to this as quickly as possible.
Your parenting experience is different than mine if you say only 2 children.
Yes. Other questions? I think we could take one more. Okay.
Thank you. So as a former adjunct, question I have is, Jared, you mentioned about the academic careers that veterans are pursuing, especially the enlisted population. Why are you seeing that they're going into those careers? What's kind of leading them to those career paths? Why those educational decisions?
I think when we think about education, we still have some flawed assumptions that people are going to college to find themselves. And if you have the economic support of your family to go to college at 17, 18, somewhere in that range, that's a traditional experience and you very well may be going to find yourself. Veterans are not necessarily in that position. They're going to create a future for themselves. That notwithstanding, they don't tend to choose in a very informed way what that degree is going to be at the beginning. They sort of do college to pull from labor, OJT, if you will. And so they're figuring it out as they go, but they wind up graduating in a degree that is arguably more academically rigorous than what a lot of American students pursue. These are degrees more likely to be pursued by, say, international students in the undergraduate experience. But they're also more economically viable post-graduation. And so even though education is not a jobs program, not in the 2-4-year or plus sense, many veterans are going to college because they know on the other side there is more economic viability with their degree, in particular in the degrees that the majority of veterans are graduating in. So I think that's why they're choosing it, informed by the fact that they are in a rush to better economic viability for not just themselves, but also their families post-military service.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists. It's been a really interesting conversation.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Well, this has been a fantastic event. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Darlene. We're going to close things out, and we're so delighted to welcome Secretary Chuck Hagel to offer remarks and to close us out. He needs no introduction, as many of you know. He served as the 24th U.S. Secretary of Defense and as a U.S. Senator from 1997 to 2009, representing his home state of Nebraska. He's the only enlisted soldier and Vietnam War veteran to serve as Secretary of Defense. We're also fortunate, and many of you might not know this, he serves on RAND's Board of Trustees, and we're honored to have him on the advisory board for the RAND Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute. He was instrumental, as Carrie mentioned, in the post-9/11 GI Bill, and currently remains committed to the focus on transition and was chairman of the Veterans Justice Commission, which many of you know released their recommendations only a few months ago. Secretary Hagel, we're honored to have you close us out today. Thanks so much.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to share a few comments with you and to the RAND leadership. It's, as you all know, so important what your panels have been talking about today and the various aspects of our veterans and how we treat them and what their future is after they leave the military and make the contributions that they do to this country. As I was listening to some of the comments, I was thinking, my brother Tom and I served together in Vietnam in 1968. Matter of fact, I was just in Nebraska last week. We had the grand opening of the first Nebraska Vietnam Memorial, which is really pretty spectacular. But when Tom and I came back, I got back in December of '68. He got back in January of '69, and we served actually together in Vietnam. We knew we had to get an education. I had attended 3 colleges, so I needed to finish college. And my educational career was not one to be emulated, but I did get through. Tom needed to start college. He went into the service right after high school. We went to the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and at that time, it was, when we started, it was the University of Omaha, but then consolidated with the Nebraska system. It was known as, along with the University of Maryland, as the 2 most friendly veteran schools. And we had what were referred to at the time as bootstrappers. And we had many military, active duty military who were there, who had been given a year or 2 to get a degree, and then many Vietnam veterans who attended as well. And I recall all of that very, very dramatically, because we both used the GI Bill to go to school, and we worked full time. And we've used the VA system. I was wounded twice, he was wounded 3 times, so we used the healthcare system, as well as the VA loan system to buy our first homes. So I have personal experience with everything that you all are talking about and what you are doing for our veterans. I want to take a little, maybe a little different approach than what you've taken this morning, because you've all covered this morning, and I just heard this panel. I did not hear the other panels, the other panel. You've delved into some of the most important aspects of our veterans' lives, their families, our country, the institutions that provide that help, DOD, VA, labor, and so many private institutions like RAND and others represented here. But it's really bigger than that. You start with the fact that our military, as you all know, is having a difficult time in recruitment. I don't think that gets any better. And it's changing strategies. It's forcing our military to change strategies in how they use their men and women. The quality of recruits is a factor. What you do and how potential recruits and their families, who usually are the most significant advisors to a young man or a young woman on whether they should go into the military or not. If they don't see the veterans of this country coming out and be treated fairly or be given certain benefits and acknowledgments, that's going to continue to affect recruitment. And it will affect, as it already is, retention. When I was secretary, I remember talking with the chiefs about this. And I said, we were starting to see issues then with recruitment. And I said, this is going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And as you also know, the pool of potential recruits is narrowing and narrowing for the reasons you all know. So my point is, what you're doing here, and you all are working on and have been, which again, I applaud you all for doing this, has a huge effect on our national security strategy, what's going on at the Pentagon, and it will affect foreign policy. It's going to affect everything. And I think then where all of this starts, and you all know it because you deal with it, is transitioning. And one of the things that the Veterans Justice Commission, which I chair that commission of tremendous people, former Secretary Panetta is on it with me, is to really focus on transition. And we've not done a good job over the years. I mean, we say we're doing it, we say we're connecting DOD and the VA and so on, but not really. I mean, we stumble and fall and say we do, but we need some attention to it, and we need attention at the highest levels. One of the recommendations that we've made, and what Raj noted in some of the recommendations that we've announced over the last 3 months, is a new Undersecretary of Defense for Transition. Now, I know there's a lot of issue with that. Oh my God, an Undersecretary, that's a hugely powerful job. Well, that's the point, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it is. But somebody at that level with that power has to be responsible for this. And there's another aspect that you guys probably didn't get into, it wasn't your deal, but was what happens to these veterans who get out in the justice system. Why do we have so many veterans in jail and a penitentiary? Well, and again, you all know this, but you look at the last 20 years, the two longest wars in the history of this country, both fought with an all-volunteer force. So, as we all know, what that means is the same men and women keep going back and back and back. And someone who's been through a war, a pretty tough one at that time in '68, I know what that does to people. My brother Tom and I have had 3 good friends who we served with in Vietnam commit suicide. And you know the numbers on this. Drug use, suicides, spousal abuse, it goes on and on. So because of the fact that the all-volunteer force was the force that fought these 20-year wars, and who knows what's in the future. And by the way, I'm not challenging an all-volunteer force. That's what we need and we have to have. But we're not addressing some of the issues that really face these young men and women when they get out. Obviously, PTSD, that's not new. We've had it in every war. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. But the same people having to go back and back and back, 12-month tours, that even puts more pressure on them emotionally and mentally. Traumatic brain injury, substance abuse. So we've got to factor all those into what we're dealing with too, when we're dealing with veterans and education and employment. But I'll go back to what I said a minute ago. I really think where all of this has to start is the transition, is giving these men and women enough time as they think about entering a whole new era in their life. When they take that uniform off and all of a sudden the next day, where am I? And you all know who have been in the military, it is a different life. It is a different life. And that's a big deal. when you make that transition. We don't help them enough. One of the things that Jim Webb, Senator Jim Webb, and I focused on in 2008 when we wrote the post-GI Bill that we passed in 2008. And it was interesting, it was over the objection of the administration and people who were carrying out these wars. And Jim and I would say, I mean, how can you object to giving these men and women who fought these wars even more options and more potential and possibilities? Well, we don't have the money. That was always the issue. But resources are important. I get that. And they're not unlimited in government, in households. I get that. But it's a priority. What do you put a priority on? Do you put a priority on the men and women who serve this country, who make the sacrifices for this country, who fight wars for this country? Is that a priority or not a priority? If it's a priority, then you find the resources, and you will do that. And so Webb and I made that argument, but we still couldn't get it done until Jim and I were talking one day, and I've known Jim Webb since the 70s. And matter of fact, he graduated from high school in Bellevue, Nebraska, where his dad was in the Air Force, and his dad was at Offutt Air Force Base. And we were talking, and I said, Jim, maybe it would help if we brought another generation of veterans into this, not just Vietnam veterans, because there weren't many of us. I think there were, at the time, 4 Vietnam veterans in the Senate. And I think that's the high point. But then we had 5, and that was the high point. And so we decided to go to 2 World War II veterans, because we still had World War II veterans in the Senate and the House. And we went to John Warner and Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey and got them behind it as well. And when we brought Warner and Lautenberg into it, it was amazing, because you had the credibility of World War II veterans, which were always a component in any debate. And you can tell we miss them today, because there's no baseline of leadership today, because that group of leaders was so respected. You didn't have to agree with them, but they were respected for their honesty, their decency, their contributions to this country, and they always put the country first, not the Republicans first, not a president first, not a Democrat first, but for the country. And they had their political issues. But we brought those 2 guys in because they represented that. We got it done over the objection of the White House and at most all of the senior members. Now, I tell you that story also because getting anything done in this town, and I don't have to remind most of you of that, always requires and always will require some political maneuvering. Not that you put that first, you can't, or you shouldn't, but it's just a fact of life. It's just reality. So the more, as you were doing, and with our Veterans Justice Commission, we've been doing this, meeting with members of the House and the Senate and the appropriate committees, both Democrats, both Republicans. You've got to bring in the political class, and you've got to bring in the leaders of our government, as I'm sure you all know. But let me end this way. Again, thanking you very, very much for what you're doing. It's too often not just a thankless job, but a misunderstood job, because when you look at the components of our society today, I mean, what do we have, 18 million veterans in the country. And each generation, that becomes less and less, obviously, as generations of veterans die off. And an all-volunteer force is a smaller force, and it's fewer people than past generations. So what you're doing here is really for the future as much as anything else. And I hope you'll continue to think that way too as you think about what you're doing. And yes, it's critical what you're doing for right now and for the people right now. But it's all about the future. Today is gone. Not a damn thing we can do about today. But we can influence tomorrow. And so for all of that, I really do appreciate what you do, because you could be doing other things. And I know you all do other things, and you should do other things. And the other thing component is important because that integrates you into society. And you really help the cause, your cause, our cause, by integrating your efforts and who you are and what you're doing into the general society, because as I said, and you all know, fewer and fewer veterans in this country. And as you know, there's an effect, there's a consequence to that, because people say, well, what's the problem? What's the big deal? And again, I'll end where I started. This has everything to do with our future and our national security, our recruitment, our retention. All of that affects our strategic decisions, certainly in national security, and that's integrated into foreign policy in the interest of this country in the world. So, happy summer. Thank you very much, and appreciate the RAND team for what they're doing to add to what you're doing. And I don't think we ever have enough of all of us pulling together on this. So best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you all so much for joining us. This was a great morning. We're so glad that you were here with us. Thanks again to the Heinz Endowments for their support, to the Epstein family, and have a great Tuesday.